It's basically the parent movie for every children's fantasy movie to come after it. That's right, today we're going to be talking about the 1939 children's fantasy classic, The Wizard of Oz. So this is going to be an in-depth review and analysis where I go through every category of the grid. Obviously it's going to contain some spoilers, but since this is literally the most watched film ever made, I don't think that's going to be a problem to too many people. I will just note really quick though that because this is such an old movie compared to, normally I review, brand new releases, so with this throwback review, I will be trying to put it within the perspective of when the movie came out, as opposed to, applying more modern standards to it, just to give it a little bit better perspective and acknowledge its place within film history. So that's just something I wanted to note real quick that I think is more important than the spoiler warning for this particular movie. So now that that's out of the way, the first category of my grid is going to be writing, plot, and genre. So I think the biggest thing of note within this movie is how well it balances the outer goals for all of the characters with inner needs. That's pretty much the entire plot of the movie. Dorothy wants to go home, so she's looking for the Wizard of Oz, and she needs to learn that there's no place like home. That's the whole point of the movie, is balancing this outer goal with this inner need. And then the same is true even with, the Cowardly Lion wants to ask for courage, but he needs to learn that he had courage all along, and etc., etc. Same is true for all of the characters. It's very simplistic in its structure, which is the way those two things work, is done really well. And as far as genre goes, it's kind of hard to talk about things this movie does well and things it doesn't, because it really almost created an entire genre by being one of the first children's fantasy movies, and certainly the first of this kind of epic nature. There had been, fantasy films have been, that's the basis of film history. You had, Méliès doing fantasy films and the Lumiere brothers doing more realistic things. So, those two, the contrast of realism and surrealism is like the basis of film history. That's the foundation of cinema. So the fantasy aspects are actually not that new, but just the epicness of it, and obviously the color was brand new. It's just revolutionary. So for that reason, I did give the genre tropes and cliches and all of that a fairly high score in my grid, even though a lot of it is very, very cliche by now. But when this came out, the whole transporting to Oz, magical worlds, this is the foundation for all of that. Even though there were fantasy movies before it, and children's movies before it, and musicals before it, we had all of those things before The Wizard of Oz, but it combined all of these elements and created something new and really became the foundation for children's fantasy movies. I also think the world building and exposition is really interesting within this movie, because we really don't get a lot of it. In modern movies, we have a tendency to over-explain everything, and every single weird thing you see needs to be noted and examined, and that's interesting. There's a reason the genre has developed to where we expect that. But it's kind of interesting and refreshing in a way to go back to older movies and see the simplicity of the world building. We really don't see much of Oz. We never hear about the Witch of the North. Is she still alive? Who knows? We know there's a yellow brick road that goes one way and a red brick road that goes another way. We don't know where the red brick road goes. Who built the Tin Man? Are there more Tin Men? Same thing with the Scarecrow. Why is he alive? Are there other living scarecrows? We don't know. Is there a whole land of talking lions the way there's, the Munchkin land? There's just a lot of questions to be answered, and none of them are addressed, which I think is interesting and leaves room for the imagination. And I think it's one of the reasons this movie has become such a classic, is because it's not over-explained. It allows the imagination to go wild and to ask these kinds of questions and wonder what else there is in the land of Oz. So I just think that's something that's really great, and something that I think has been lost over time, for better or worse. It's a little bit of both, because there is a certain kind of magic to this very limited version of Oz that we see here, but I also find myself wanting to see a bigger picture. You could almost have a TV show of people just wandering around Oz and getting into adventures, and who knows what they'll find. I mean, that I would watch that probably, you know? So there's a lot to explore, and I think it's really, really interesting, and it's really surprising that we haven't seen more done within this world over time. This movie came out in 1939, and we still haven't seen. I mean, there was a sequel that came out. There was a miniseries with Zooey Deschanel. There's been things here and there, but nothing big Hollywood that I can think of. At least there was The Wiz. So you know, there's things here and there, but not as much as you would think. I mean, like I said, I would seriously watch a whole TV show that just, with or without Dorothy, just took place in Oz, and what are you going to see? So I just think that the world building and the limited world building just adds a whole other dimension and really lets the imagination go wild. So I thought that was just really well done and really part of what makes this movie such a classic. I think the only thing that I really don't like within the plot structure, even though it is part of what makes it such a classic, is the whole "it was just a dream" trope, which again, I doubt that was much of a trope then, if at all. I don't know how often it had been used prior to this movie, but it's certainly been used again and again and again since, and nobody ever likes it when it's done. This is really the exception that proves the rule, I guess, even though, I mean, I think the only reason it's an exception is because it was the first or one of the first to do it, but it's just kind of disappointing, and I choose to believe that she really was transported. I don't know. Oz has to really exist, right? So the whole "it's just a dream" thing it bothered me as a kid, and it bothers me as an adult, and it's really the only flaw that I see with this movie, and I'm sure most people don't see it as a flaw, because I don't think this movie would be the classic it is if it bothered other people as much as it bothers me. So the total score for plot and genre is going to be an 8.2 out of 10, which I consider to be outstanding. It's definitely not perfect. There are a few things here and there. The biggest thing of note being the whole "it's just a dream" thing. But you know, just a few things here and there that kind of keep it from being what I would consider a perfect category, but it's still well above average, and really, you know, there's a reason this movie is a classic. It's not just Judy Garland, it's not just that it's a musical, it comes within the plot and the genre and the way it formed a genre. So yeah, definitely outstanding for this category. So the next category is going to be writing characters. And I already talked about how the character inner needs work really well with the outer goals of the characters throughout the plot. So I'm not going to rehash that too much, but that was definitely the biggest strength within this category. And along that same line, characters also had very distinct character arcs that really just went along with, you know, once those inner needs and the outer goals met, their arc was complete. It's just very well structured. So I really appreciated just that, even though it was very simple and more so aimed at children than adults, but it's still a very complete arc and a very defined arc, and I appreciated that. So that definitely got it a boost within this category as well. And I also really liked the dialogue throughout the film. I thought there was a lot of foreshadowing, you know, back when she's in Kansas and she falls into the pig pen, and then she's saved by, I don't remember his name, but the same actor who plays the Cowardly Lion in the Oz sequences. And, you know, she asks him, "Well, weren't you afraid?" And, you know, that mirrors his story arc as the Cowardly Lion in her dream. So I thought that things like that worked really well. And the dialogue just felt fairly natural, and definitely a quick back and forth at times that felt fairly modern. Almost felt like a Sorkin or a, you know, Amy Sherman Palladino, something, you know, very quick back and forths, but also had a very Kansas farm. It was like Gilmore Girls on a farm, I guess. That's not what The Wizard of Oz is, but just particularly in the Kansas scenes, there was just a very quick back and forth between people, and it just really helped set the pace and helped, you know, make it feel like, you know, Dorothy wanted this fast-paced life, and everybody's asking her to slow down, and she just wants something, you know, something a little bit more. So I thought that even though that's not what she was saying, that was conveyed very well within the dialogue exchanges, particularly between her and Auntie M. So I liked the way the dialogue, not just what they were saying, but how they were saying it. I liked the way it worked within the movie. One thing I will say about the characters, I didn't really know if I should talk about this within the plot or the characters, but I do just think it's funny, and this is probably more of a, you know, watching an older movie in hindsight, but those characters really take manslaughter very lightly. I mean, I guess the house falling on the witch, that's really more the Twister's fault than Dorothy's, so she's probably off the hook there. But then throwing the water and melting the witch, yeah, she was evil, but that was still an accidental death, which again, this is much more in hindsight. Nowadays in children's movies, you don't kill the villain, you just don't. So it's definitely more of a hindsight thing, and it was accidental. She was trying to put out a fire that the witch started, and she was the one keeping buckets of water stored in her castle when she would melt at the slightest touch of water. So, I take it back. Maybe it was just all the witch's fault. So, what are you going to do? So the total score for the writing characters section is actually going to be the same as the plot and genre section, and also scored an 8.2 out of 10, which is outstanding. So the next category is going to be acting and casting. And this category is one that's usually particularly difficult to judge for older movies, because there was definitely a very clear shift in styles of acting in about the 50s when method acting started to come to the scene. So movies before the 1950s definitely have that more theatrical stage acting as opposed to film acting. There's a very distinct difference, and usually I have a hard time getting past that kind of stage acting. Even like Audrey Hepburn, who's one of the greatest, and she was phenomenal, and yet she has that very stagey, particularly in her earlier movies, that very stagey theatrical acting style that just kind of grates on my nerves after a while. But that said, I felt like that was a little bit more limited in this movie, and it's probably because it's a musical, so you kind of expect that more, theatrical vibe to it to begin with, and then half the dialogue is delivered through singing, so that's gonna be change the vibe a little bit as well. So I really didn't feel like it was too over the top in its theatrics or in its stage acting kind of vibe. And as far as the casting goes, I thought the casting was just phenomenal. I mean, who else but Judy Garland could have, obviously we say that now, but it was just a phenomenal choice. And within the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Lion, you have Ray Bolger playing the Scarecrow, Burt Lahr as the Cowardly Lion, and Jack Haley as the Tin Man. And they're just phenomenal, and you really don't, those aren't household names for the most part. People really don't talk about them much when they talk about The Wizard of Oz. It's all about Judy Garland, and she does steal the show, but those three men were just phenomenal in there. Just the physical movements during the dance scenes, and the facial expressions they're able to convey despite wearing so much, being in full costumes. So they were just phenomenal. I really, particularly as an adult, I really didn't remember their performances much, because it had been about 15 years, if not more, since I had seen this movie when I went to see it for this review. So I really, I remembered some of their songs, and, I remembered what they looked like, but I really didn't remember too much about their performances, and I was really blown away, and I'm not sure why they're not talking about more, because they were just the physicality and like I said, the emotions, and just the line deliveries were solid. Like, they gave phenomenal performances and really matched Judy Garland in a lot of ways. Particularly, I think they exceeded her performance when it comes to the the dancing and the physicality, and really matched her when it comes to line deliveries and the singing and things like that. Like, it was just a phenomenal cast all around, and just fun to watch them perform and interact with each other. The dynamics between everybody was really solid. The total score for acting and casting is going to be an 8.9 out of 10, which again is outstanding, and even more so than the script overall. It's just phenomenal and classic and timeless, and what more can you say about it? It's outstanding. So the next category in the grid is going to be cinematography, lighting. And this is a movie that, as far as the look goes, it really stands the test of time, and particularly because it was one of the first movies to be filmed in color, and it was an extravaganza. It was epic. It was brand new, not new technology, but newly used in this way, and one of the first big Hollywood movies to be in color, if not the first big Hollywood movie to be in color. So as far as the cinematography goes in that regard, I mean, it really easily could have been a disaster. So I mean, filming in black and white is very different than filming in color. It just, you have to set the lighting differently. It's all, with black and white, it's all about the contrasts and how the darks and lights play against each other, whereas in color, I mean, it's completely different. You have color, and particularly with Technicolor, where it's, quite a bit more limited than what we have today as far as color, it's still not quite, what you see with your eyes in front of you is not what you see on the monitor that you're filming. If they even had monitors back then, I'm not even sure. I guess they just looked through the camera, or maybe they had monitors. I don't know. But, regardless, what you see is not what you see. And so for this to be the first, big movie that used this technology, and to have it look so well then and now is that's no small feat. Just the lighting overall is just phenomenally well done, and it was such a technological achievement at the time, and to have it hold up as well now as it did then. I mean, compare this with the similar technological achievement of when sound first came to the screen, and you have the jazz singer, which nobody's really seen, nobody really talks about, except to mention that it was the first movie to have sound, and it just didn't have the same lasting impact. So it really, it's not just the use of color that makes this movie a classic, but the fact that they were so successful at utilizing this brand new technology is just really impressive. And so yeah, that's the biggest thing of note in this category. But it is, it's important to add that it still looks beautiful and amazing. I went and saw it when I watched it for this review. I went to a local theater that was playing it, and there was tons of kids in the audience that had never seen the movie before. And the moment where the house lands and she opens the house and it goes from, the house is in black and white, it's color in front of her, there were just kids throughout the whole audience just gasping and just in awe at how beautiful and amazing it was. And it was great that it can still have that impact on people who have never seen the movie before is amazing. So I gave the lighting category overall a 9.4 out of 10, which is outstanding. It didn't quite get a perfect score, just because there were a few areas that I just, it was very, very beautiful and definitely stands the test of time, but I just didn't feel like it was pushed into that perfect range. It just wasn't quite there, but very close, very impressive. Still, really stands the test of time. This movie just looks beautiful. So the next category is going to be cinematography, camera work. This one is a little bit hard for me to judge for older movies, particularly, 1939. This was made before Citizen Kane, which is, I hate to reference that movie because it's way over-referenced, but, I mean, you can't get around it. It was the movie that, changed the way we think about the camera in relation to storytelling. For the most part, movies before Citizen Kane are shot very traditionally. You've got a few close-ups here and there, mostly medium to long shots, not even really a lot of back and forth dialogue shots. It's very, it's mostly group shots of people talking. It's, by today's standards, very uninspired. So it's a little bit difficult to judge camera work for older movies. That said, there's definitely some, compositions within The Wizard of Oz that definitely help tell the story and are definitely very well done and very iconic. You have a few scenes sprinkled in where it's the four main characters linking arms, skipping down the yellow brick road. You see them from behind. Very iconic shot, very well known. So it didn't really do anything new, didn't really do anything exciting. I didn't deduct any points because, for the time period that it was made in, it did exactly what it was supposed to do and did it well, but I didn't give it any extra points really either, because, it wasn't doing anything new. It was doing exactly what was expected. So the overall score for the camera work section is going to be a 6.2 out of 10, which still exceeds my expectations overall. It did what it set out to do, and it did it well, even if by today's standards, it's a little bland. The next category is going to be editing and special effects. And the editing is going to be pretty similar to the camera work overall, in that for the most part, editing at this point in time, aside from being used for special effects, which we'll get to in a sec, it really didn't. It's very, classical and visible editing, nothing too different or unique. So the editing was well done. I didn't really see any continuity issues or anything like that, but it just really didn't do anything particularly inspiring either within editing overall. And as far as special effects go, this is definitely a category where you've got to look at it from the lens of 1939. And from that perspective, I mean, the special effects are pretty great, and they actually stand the test of time fairly well. It's definitely, a lot of obvious green screen, particularly in the very iconic scene where she's in the house and the tornado's going around and she sees the people flying by, very obviously green screen, but it doesn't look bad. You don't see any green halos or anything like that. So, I mean, as far as, utilizing the technology they had available at the time, it was phenomenal. And even everything's done very practically. Have the witch doing the smoke bombs, and, it's pretty obvious. They just open a trap door and she goes down, close it, smoke clears. It's not a great mystery how they filmed it, but it looks good with what they have. And, same thing goes with the superimposed images whenever whenever Glenda appears. It's no great mystery how they filmed it, but it looks pretty solid and holds up fairly well considering how old the movie is, and it's not, the special effects aren't distracting. It's not like the awkward early 2000s movies that are just starting to utilize CGI. It's like, oh, that's really bad. It's nothing cringeworthy. It just looks like older special effects and ones that were really well done for the time. So as far as that goes, I thought the special effects were really good and really hold up fairly well for such an old movie. So the total score for the editing and special effects category overall is going to be a 6.9 out of 10. So that's a score I consider to be exceeding my expectations, but it doesn't quite, it's still held back from that outstanding category, mostly because, the similar reasons I was talking about with Camerawork, where, it does what it was expected to do within the time frame that the movie was made, but doesn't really do anything particularly interesting or innovative within the editing for the time that it was made in. So I pretty much just gave it, neutral scores in those categories just because, it really wasn't doing anything that would exceed my expectations for a movie within that time period. So the next category in the grid is going to be sound design. And this one, I don't really have a ton to say. Obviously, the score and soundtrack, they're amazing and extremely iconic and, still referenced constantly again and again and again in popular culture and just everyday conversations even. So, that obviously score and soundtrack is perfect and iconic and all that good stuff. But as far as just the sound mixing and sound design, things like that go, it was fine. It was, I guess, about what I would expect within the time period. There are a few things like, when she oils the oil can for the Tin Man, and it's just so loud. I think within earlier movies, there's just this generalized expectations that audiences wouldn't get it unless you made it really obvious. So, that's a part of it. They amplified sound effects for things like that, so beyond a shadow of a doubt that there's oil coming out of that can. So things like that just don't necessarily hold up the best, and yet I think it's very much so just a product of its time. So it's hard to really fault it for things like that, but it's definitely, as a modern viewer watching it, it's definitely noticeable. So the overall score for the sound design is going to be a 6.4 out of 10. So it didn't get into that outstanding range despite having, a perfect score and soundtrack, really just because every other area within the sound design was pretty neutral, pretty much just met my expectations for a movie within that time period. And, similar to camera work and editing, it's just pretty locked into what was expected within, a 30s movie. So the next category is going to be aesthetics, which I kind of divide up into two areas. And it's going to be the character aesthetics of hair, makeup, and costumes, and the environmental aesthetics of sets, props, and locations. So as far as the character aesthetics go, definitely, it's got to be perfect in all three of those things I mentioned. The hair, you've got the iconic braids, and even things like the Cowardly Lion getting his hair permed, things like that are a little bit more kooky. Just every character has a unique look and feel. And then with makeup and costumes, you have things like the green-skinned witch and her minions, and Dorothy's iconic dress, and the costumes for the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion are all just phenomenal. Although, side note, why are more people not scared of the Scarecrow? Everybody always talks about the monkeys, and they're creepy, don't get me wrong, but the Scarecrow is creepy. He's got a burlap sack for a hat and is spilling his straw guts constantly. Like, that's kind of creepy. But regardless, the costume design looks good, if creepy. But anyway, that was just a random side note. But yeah, so within the character aesthetics overall, I gave all three categories perfect 10s, mostly because of how iconic it has become. I also gave the sets and locations a perfect 10 out of 10. It's definitely, it's very obvious that there's painted backdrops and things like that. But for the time period it was made, it was phenomenal. I mean, really, like I said, when I watched it in the theater and when Dorothy opens the door and goes to Oz for the first time, there were literally audible gasps from children throughout the audience. It was amazing. So, it definitely, it still looks amazing. And for, putting yourself within the time period of 1939, it's just, I mean, it's amazing. Like, it really took the technology available and built it out to the max. And then within the sets and things like that, I mean, this, because it's such an old movie, you obviously know, like, none of this is CGI. They hand-built every single building you see, every, the yellow brick road when it's not obviously painted, that's real, that's physical. The characters are interacting with those things. There's just something magical about knowing that there's something physically there for the characters to interact with. So this was definitely, even by today's standards, I think there's still a magic there, even though it's very, very different than the CGI environments we get today. Now, the one thing that didn't get a perfect score within this category is going to be the props. The one thing that stands out the most to me, and this might be nitpicky, but I feel like even for the time it was made, this seemed hokey when our main characters leave Emerald City to go look for the witch, and they arm themselves with weapons. And the weapons look over the top cartoony, which very well could have been the intent since it is, a kid's movie and it's a musical, but it just, there had to have been better props available at the time. I mean, the Cowardly Lion comes out with what almost looks like a giant inflatable hammer that you would get as, like, a prize at a carnival. I'm sure it wasn't inflatable, but it had that look to it, like, it's just ridiculous. And Tin Man, who already has an axe that he pretty much never uses throughout the whole movie, is double wielding the axe and a wrench. I think it was a wrench, at least, that looked almost exactly like the axe. I don't know why he wouldn't just use the axe. But that was just kind of silly, and it was a huge wrench. Like, why did he have such an oversized wrench? And then the Scarecrow comes out with a pistol or a revolver or whatever that looks very fake. But so why did he pick a revolver? And if he had that to begin with, and then they just drop their weapons and leave them when they actually go, when they find Toto and are like, okay, let's go. And they leave all their weapons behind, except Tin Man still has his axe, which he never uses, and that just bothered me. I know it's a kid's movie, you're not going to see them hitting flying monkeys over the head with an axe or a wrench or whatever. I'm certainly not shooting them with a rifle, but or a revolver, but it was just those weapon choices were so specific and they looked so fake. And there were a few other things throughout within the props that just kind of didn't do it for me, but those were the main ones that really knocked the score down and kept this category from getting a perfect 10 out of 10. This category still got a 9.6 out of 10 though, which is almost perfect. I still consider it outstanding and definitely well above average, but just, those props really dragged the category down just a little bit for me. So the next category is going to be impact on film, which I divide up into historical impact, critical impact, and audience impact. And I don't really have too much to say about this category because I think it's pretty obvious that it gets a perfect 10 out of 10 in all three. You know, there's, like I keep saying, there's a reason this movie is a classic and it's the most watched movie ever made. It's mentioned all the time in film textbooks. It's referenced throughout pop culture. It's, you know, inspired just about every kid who's ever seen it. You know, it's just, it's just one of those movies that sparks your imagination and gets you thinking. And, it's just easily perfect 10 out of 10 for impact on film. Easily. So next category is going to be overall enjoyment. And for Wizard of Oz, I gave this category a 9 out of 10. You know, it wasn't quite a perfect 10 out of 10, but I definitely enjoyed it far more than I thought I would. You know, I watched it quite a bit when I was, a little kid. And then I most recently watched it when I was probably about 14 or 15, somewhere in there. Because I had heard the urban legend that you can see someone hanging themselves in the background, which is not true, but I was a morbid kid and rented Wizard of Oz and watched the whole thing from beginning to end because of that. Weird kid. Anyway, so yeah, those are pretty much my main memories of the movie. But I do remember loving the sequel, Return to Oz, way more than the original, which most people don't even know there was a sequel. And I don't remember much about the sequel, so it clearly hasn't stood the test of time in my memory. And that one had a lot of dark and disturbing things from what I've read about it as an adult. A lot of people are like, why was this a kid's movie? Nobody liked it. It was too creepy. Again, I was a weird kid. But I remember liking the sequel more, and I remember not being that big of a fan of the original Wizard of Oz. So I was a little bit worried going back to it, having not seen it for, 15 years or so. And I was worried that, I wasn't going to like it or wouldn't have that much to say about it. And I was pleasantly surprised. This movie, it stands the test of time, and it's fun, and it was a great experience to be able to see it in a theater setting with, a lot of people, like I said, brought their kids who had never seen it before. So it's just a great community experience to be able to watch it with a group of people like that. And it's just, it's a great movie. It really stands the test of time. And particularly, it's always iffy with older movies. There's always at least one thing that doesn't age well. And I really didn't feel like that was the case. I know there's a lot of issues as far as, little people and representation, with the Munchkins. And I'm sure there were behind the scenes things that aren't great, both with the casting and the treatment of the little people actors, as well as, just watching the movie, I couldn't help but think most of these animals were probably mistreated. I hope not, but especially, there's the scenes with the horses of different colors, and I'm like, did they actually paint these horses? I hope not, but probably. So things like that, where there's definitely some things that maybe behind the scenes don't hold up too much over time, but I really didn't feel like, there was nothing aside from maybe the creepy, flying monkeys. There wasn't really anything that I was like, oh, I wouldn't show this to my 4-year-old niece, it was like, oh, maybe she would like this. Maybe this is one I could try and show her. So, it in that regard, it stands the test of time much better than a lot of other movies from the 30s, even though there are some things that are still problematic and still topics of discussion. Just watching the movie, it's not as apparent. So I thought that was refreshing as well, because that is always iffy going back to older movies. Even things like E.T., I've watched bits and pieces thinking about bringing that to show my niece, and it's like, they swear constantly, which, this should have been PG-13 probably. So things like that where I'm like, I don't want to show this to my niece, even though I grew up watching it as a kid. But I didn't feel like that with this. So that kind of added to my enjoyment as well. Just, thinking about, this is a movie I can add to my collection to introduce to her. And if I have kids someday, I'm sure this would be one that I would show them as well once they get a little bit, old enough. Because it's just, it's a classic, and it really holds up well over time. And it's really one of those movies that just gets the imagination going in just the right way. That's just, even as an adult, it's, I love coming up with questions about Oz and trying to answer them in my head and wondering what else is out there, even though I guess it's all a dream, so it's all irrelevant. But I don't like to believe that. I think the Oz is really there somehow, but whatever. So, but yeah, so overall enjoyment, I was pleasantly surprised going into it and watching it as an adult. So I gave it a 9 out of 10 for overall enjoyment. I also gave The Wizard of Oz 3 points of extra credit. They're kind of for things I already mentioned, but oh well. So the first is going to be for the audience experiences that I've mentioned a few times throughout this review. Just seeing it with a community of people, so many of whom were kids who had never seen the movie. It was great, and I really didn't, it was kind of a late-ish showing, so I wasn't sure what the audience would be, and with this particular theater, when I've done their older movie showings in the past, it's, usually I'm the youngest person there by far, so I wasn't sure going into a kids movie at this venue. I wasn't sure what the audience would be like, if it was going to be, more, elderly people or middle-aged people, or if it was going to be younger people, more my age, taking their kids to see it. I wasn't sure. It was really a mix of all of those. It was really a diverse group of people, particularly age-wise, and so being able to have, a kid behind you gasping at the beauty of Oz, and then, an older person in front of you remembering seeing the movie as a kid. It was a great experience just being able to hear little bits and pieces here and there of different people enjoying the movie in a different way, and at different stages in life. It was just interesting and fun, and really added to the experience overall. On a similar train of thought, I also gave it a point of extra credit for just the timelessness of the movie. That you can have so many different, such a diverse audience, and have everybody in that theater enjoying the movie on the same level, and just being taken away by the magic of this movie made in 1939. It's just, there's just something beautiful there, and just the power of film that, because not all films stand the test of time. Most films don't stand the test of time. You watch it 20 or 30 years later, it's like, ooh, that, in one way or another, there's something that doesn't hold up. You can still love it, looking back on it, but there's usually at least one thing that doesn't hold up. And this movie really doesn't have that one thing. It's just timeless. It is a classic, and there's, I said earlier that there's, so much room for, you could have a whole TV show of just Oz. Like, there's this whole universe to explore, but they really haven't too much. I think that's just because this movie is so timeless. Just go back and watch this again and again and again, There's just something about it that's just timeless, and there's just no need for any additions to this universe, because you already have the Wizard of Oz. So for sure I gave it an extra point of extra credit for that as well. And then the last point of extra credit I gave to the Wizard of Oz because of all those unanswered questions that I was talking about earlier. I know I talked about this already within the world building section of plot and genre, but just the number of unanswered questions is so unusual by today's standards, and really, like I was saying, it just sparks your imagination and makes you want to know more about this universe, makes you want to read the whole series of books. That's something I think a lot of people forget. There's not just the one story, there's a whole series of books about Oz. So there's just, there's a whole universe, and this movie really makes you want to delve in and learn more. What's at the end of the Red Brick Road? Who rules the North? If there is no Witch of the North, does Glenda rule all of Oz now? Is the only witch? Are there going to be replacement witches? There's so many unanswered questions, and I love it. So that's just fun and exciting, and something you don't see a lot in movies today. So I easily gave it that third point of extra credit for all of the unanswered questions about Oz. So the total score for The Wizard of Oz is going to be an 84.3. So it's definitely something I consider to be, well exceeds my expectations. But I consider it to be an outstanding movie. It's not perfect. There are some flaws, or at least maybe not necessarily flaws, but just things that aren't pushed into perfect, or that, just meet my expectations as to what a movie from 1939 would be. It did a lot of new things, and really kickstarted the use of film, color film in a big way, and it's hugely important. But there are still some categories that just just meet my expectations, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that, and it still holds the test of time very well, and is still a fantastic movie, and one that I look forward to sharing with children in my life, and just continuing the legacy of this movie, because it's great, but just not perfect. But few movies, if any, are. So 84.3, definitely a very strong score, and a timeless classic. And if it's been a while since you've seen it, go out and watch it again. Even if you just saw it last week, go watch it again. You can watch it over and over and over again, and it's always fun, and it's just great. And it's definitely one, I don't own it in my personal collection. I didn't really have too much interest in it before now, but now that I've seen it again as an adult, it definitely makes me want to, add it to my collection and have at my disposal to watch whenever I get the urge to just have fun and escape to a magical world and sing and dance and look at pretty pictures. It's great in that regard. So that's it for my review of The Wizard of Oz. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back next week with another throwback review of Mary Poppins. Hey, thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe to Griddy Films on YouTube by pressing this button. Also, like and share this video. You can follow Griddy Films on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for new video announcements, entertainment news, fun pics, and more. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.